Do you want to go faster? Then take care of your bearings. Hi there, my name is Raymond Jones and I'm a coach with Wheels of Fire Wheelchair Racing. In this video, we're going to talk about bearings, specifically the rear wheel bearings for a racing wheelchair. The rear wheels of a racing wheelchair take a lot of punishment. We put a lot of work into them and we want a lot of speed. You may find that maybe as you're pushing along, you're hearing a grinding sound or a popping sound, or it could be that you tighten the axle of the wheel into the racing wheelchair, but there's still some wobble in that wheel. Well, you might want to check out the bearing. It could be that the inner or the outer bearing is worn out and it needs to be replaced. In this video, we're going to talk about how to replace them and service them. But before we get into it, we want you to understand exactly how is the bearing designed. If you're going to care for the bearings of a racing wheelchair, it's kind of important to understand how a bearing itself works. Now we have this big automotive bearing and we want to show you kind of the parts and pieces that make up a sealed bearing. So there are balls on the inside and those are greased. Those balls may be made of steel, they may be made of ceramic. There are a lot of different kinds that are out there and they roll inside on the races. You have an inner race is what it's called and an outer race. And the inner and outer races, they kind of form the lanes, the track that the balls on the inside are going to roll in. Now a sealed bearing has a seal on each side. This keeps the grease in and the debris out. That is how a sealed bearing is designed. So you've determined that you need to replace a bearing in a racing wheelchair wheel. How do you make sure you get the correct one? You're going to need a measurement of the outside diameter of the entire bearing. You're going to need a measurement of the inner hole, and then you're also going to need a measurement of the thickness of the bearing. Now, if you don't have some measuring tool like that, you can very easily just take a ruler that has centimeters on it and hold the bearing to get its thickness, to get its outer diameter, and then figure the diameter of the hole. But basically, you're going to round that up in millimeters, and then you're going to search that online. With those three measurements, look up the bearing that you need. So as we're talking about bearings, let's take a closer look at which bearings may be best in your situation. Steel ball bearings inside of a sealed bearing are going to be able to handle the punishment of like road racing. If you're going to be bumping over the miles, then the balls that are in there that are steel are going to handle that pounding. However, if you are track racing, then a ceramic ball bearing may be better for you. Those ceramics are a little quicker, and when races are decided by 100th of a second, that little edge may be to your favor. Thing to remember though is that a ceramic bearing is just going to get pounded and beat up, and you're probably going to replace it more often. If you're going to be doing lots of road racing or putting on lots of miles, then a steel ball bearing is probably going to be best. If you want quick and you're willing to replace them more often, maybe you want to go with ceramic. Now, a part of bearing maintenance is to properly grease a sealed bearing. When you purchase them, they are greased, but maybe the grease that they're using from the factory isn't what you want to use, or just use over time, they need to be re-greased. First of all, you have to take one of the seals out. There are two seals. You can remove either one, it doesn't matter. You're using a sharp utility knife like this. If you just wedge that into the little edge here and you work slowly and you just pry in a few places, then you get the blade underneath of it and lift the seal out of the way. Now what you'll find is most designs, they have something that retains the balls inside of the races, but there's gaps around that. So you can very easily put the grease around it. And then you're going to put just a little bit of grease in here. Now, if you don't like getting your hands messy, get a friend to do this for you. All right, so we're going to take some grease and we're going to put it down in the tracks where the balls run. So I just squeeze a little in and then roll it around a little farther and squeeze a little more and just keep doing that all around. Now, I don't have to do a huge amount. There's not a whole lot of space inside of the races where the balls are. And now's the part where you really get into the work. You take your finger and you just work that grease down into that channel. And I'm forcing the grease down in between the balls. Now, Here's the part that's the easiest. You take your seal, put the side that was inside to begin with back in place, and then you just press it in with your fingers. And you just want to go all the way around so that it snaps in place. Now the bearing is all sealed back in place. If you just take it, hold the center race, and begin to turn it around, it'll move that grease around and get all of it greased up and ready to go. The first wheel type that we're going to look at for maintaining or replacing the bearings is a spoke wheel. Spoke wheels are fairly common and very easy to maintain when it comes to bearings. Let me show you how this is done. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to slip the axle out. The axle goes straight through the bearings, and there's a little spacer that's between the bearings. If you look down in there, you can see it. So once the axle is removed, then we can remove the bearing. What you don't want to do is to try and pry the bearing out of its side. What you actually want to do is you want to drive the bearing out, down through something. So I'm using this old automotive bearing to create a hole as a well, and then I set the hub of the wheel over top of it so that I can drive it out. But before I do that, I want you to get an idea and a concept in your head of how to do this in a safe way that's not going to damage the wheelchair wheel. What you'll notice is we talked about that there's an inner and an outer race. If you just start pounding away trying to drive that bearing out, you could be pounding on either the seal or the inner race, and you just shove the insides of that bearing straight out, and then the outer race gets stuck in the hub of the wheel. You don't want that to happen. So what you want to do is to angle whatever you're using. If you're using like a flat blade screwdriver, you want to angle it down through the hole to catch the outer race of the bearing that's on the opposite side of the wheel. With that in place, you tap it a couple of times. Now what you want to do is switch it to the other side so that you have the other edge. And so what you're doing is walking it out of the hole. It really didn't take much. Check it out. There's the spacer, and the bearing that was on the lower side of the wheel came right out. Now I want to get the front or the outside bearing out. Now you can see all the way through that hub. Both of the bearings have been removed, and we can service them, replace them, whatever it is that we need to do. All right, so now's the time to put our bearing back in our spoke wheel, and we're going to put the inner bearing in. So you just line it up to the hole. Once you have it lined up to it, and you want to get it fairly level, but it's not like it has to be science. And then you probably want to use something like a piece of wood that you can strike the piece of wood and not the bearing, so you're not going to tear it up. And so we grab our piece of wood, we lay it over top, tap it a couple times, check our level, looks good. Now, you don't want to make the mistake that I make so many times. When you flip the wheel over, don't forget there's that little spacer, and you're going to want it on the inside. Lay the bearing back in its place, get it lined up with the hole, and do the same thing. And then you can slip your axle back down through. Ta-da! Spoke wheel is now reassembled, bearings replaced. The next wheel type we'd like to highlight for you that's about servicing or replacing bearings is this Funkorama quad spoke carbon fiber wheel. What you'll notice is that it has a special piece on the outside, and a 10mm Torx wrench fits it. And then on the axle, there are some flat spaces in and among the threads. Now, you do not want to use just a pair of pliers or vice grips or something like that to try and hold those flat spots as you're loosening the outer cap. If you slip it all, it's just going to chew those threads up, and then you won't be able to thread it back into the rear axle of your racing wheelchair. Instead, you want something like a crescent wrench. So you fit it down good and snug on the flat places, and then you take your 10mm Torx wrench, fit it into the hub, and break it loose. And then the axle just slides right out of the wheel. And now I have an inner and an outer bearing, just like the metal spoke wheel, and I need to knock those through. Same kind of process. And then the one that I'm trying to drive out is the inner bearing. So I'm going to make sure that I miss the outer bearing, slide this screwdriver in place, catch the outer race. There we go. The inner bearing is out. This wheel also has a spacer, so you want to keep in mind that the spacer needs to go back in. Now I need to get the outer bearing out. All right, all that pounding, and out she came. And that is how you remove the bearings of a quad spoke carbon fiber wheel. Now we're finished either servicing the bearings or we're going to replace the bearings in this quad spoke carbon fiber wheel. And so let's show you how to put it back together. The parts and pieces that make up the axle on the inside, the axle is machined in such a way that it requires a more open hole and a bit of a different dimension bearing that goes on the inside. And then there is this spacer. Now notice the spacer has a ledge right here. It's more open on this side. What you'll discover is if you try to put it in backwards, it won't go. So it's intended to go this way. And then you have the cap. So turn the wheel, hand rim down. I want to inspect on the inside. There's not anything down in there. I don't have sand or some rough things like that that are just tearing things up. And now I want to put the inner bearing in place. And then take something to protect the bearing and hold it in place and begin tapping it down. And then I'm going to put my outer bearing and my spacer in place. Remember, the spacer goes in, the axle's coming up from the bottom, the spacer goes so that the little shelf on the inside of it goes up. Then I drop my bearing in place and it kind of sits in there, but it's not quite down. If you look for a socket and if I slip it down in the hole, notice that it goes all the way in and it sets easily. But if I hold the outer race of the bearing to the dimension of the socket, it fits it almost perfectly, 13/16. So then I want to drop my bearing in place, just set the socket on it, and just a couple of taps. Now the reason you want to tap this down in place is you don't want to be using this machined aluminum cap to try and pull that bearing down. You just strip the threads out in it. Double check things. Looks like it lines up well. My inner bearing is in place. Now what I should be able to do is to slip my axle right through. Right, everything seats up well on the back side too. Now, I take my cap and I just start it with my fingers. We take our torque wrench again. All right, and we just start turning it a little and it loosens right up and it's ready to roll. That, my friends, is our video on how to replace and maintain bearings in the rear wheels for racing wheelchairs. We've talked about how to measure the bearings so that you order the correct size for your wheel. We've talked about how to grease those bearings so that they are properly lubricated for the most speed you can get. And we've talked about how to replace bearings in both a carbon fiber wheel and a metal spoke wheel. Speaking of grease, maybe there's a particular kind of grease that you think is best for you to get the most speed out of your wheels. If you have one, post it in the comment section below. Hope this video has been helpful to you. If it has, would you consider liking or subscribing to our channel? Thanks for watching. This is Raymond Jones with Wheels of Fire saying, keep 'em rolling.